hope you have your microwave meals and drinks ready. I know a few of the panelists have got their drinks. I've got my usual bitter, and I believe Chris has got the same food on the menu as myself this evening, which is a packet of Pringles. But hopefully you've got your dinners ready. I think we'll get started. I will introduce you to our panel guests. Not one, not two, but three panel guests this week. So first of all, we have Chris Grant, who is Law Tech Director at Barclays Ventures. Hey. And I don't know where he is on your screen, but he's down there on mine. We have Gareth Evans from Digital Risk Advisors, who I've worked with at PwC, and he's a regular attendee at the Supper Clubs. And we have Thomas Alderse Baas, if I pronounce that right, Thomas, who is AI certified very recently and is a senior GRC leader at Bowmen Group. So we will, hopefully, if Nicola is able to put a camera on, we can get. I can hear you. That's good.
Yes. So what I am getting a message when I say share my camera, Lee, just so that you know, it is telling me that all webcam spaces are currently being used. If one becomes available, we will let you on. So
I'll turn it off and then I'll let you on. But before I do, I wanted to, this is going to be interesting in managing, the 6 people on the panel. So I've got a very cheap "Have I got news for you" wheel for when we go around, and I'll choose who gets the question first as we go through the next half an hour. So let me turn my camera off and I'll start asking the questions so we can let Nicola back in. So here we go. Let me do that. And that should allow you into the room. While we're doing that, I've got a couple of questions that I think might be pertinent for Gareth and for Thomas very quickly. But Gareth, there's one for you and the group, obviously. How helpful were these PRA, FCA operational resilience requirements be in managing future crisis? Should non-FS entities consider adopting its principles?
Okay, thanks, Lee. I think, actually, if it's all right, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the challenges I'm seeing in the banking sector that might then speak to whether those regulations can be helpful or not. I think very much about the here and now, right? So, the last few weeks, and the feedback I'm getting is that we're getting through this, but it could have been a lot easier, right? So we had these huge BCM plans, these business continuity management plans. We finally got to dust down for this very kind of an event. But there are fundamentally 3 challenges. One was they were simply too large and unmanageable. They covered absolutely everything that a bank might operate day to day. The second thing is that they were static. They weren't a live thing. So to quote one client, our plan said, right, that press is over by John. Right, where's John? Okay, we can't find him. So that they were unmanageable and unworkable. The third thing is, frankly, they came up with ideas and concepts that were irrelevant, and particularly more so with the advent of FinTech. But there was so much time was invested in how do we make sure we have secondary sites for our staff. Well, you know what? Look, we're all at home right now, right? We're all working perfectly comfortably at home. So why do we need these things? So if I think about the PRA and FCA guidance that started to come out from late last year, even before COVID kicked off, I think the win-win with it is that it's saying we need to focus from a customer and market point of view and think about it from a service line point of view from their perspective, right? So when we think about regulatory compliance, we want to think which of these processes are critical in any crisis. Start with those and start with it from a customer disruption point of view. What can they not withstand? And the interesting thing that Nicola was pointing out that made me really think is we can model today based on a business as usual what that looks like, but it will change, right? So what people need when we go into crisis mode will be very different to what day-to-day life looks like. But either way, if we can prioritize per the regulation the service lines that matter most, and then just limit our focus on the technologies and the systems and the people around those areas, then we are limiting the scope of what a plan needs to look like. So that makes it more manageable. But with that said, I can see people getting so fixated on that regulation that they fail to take a step back and think about the things that will make us avoid that going through to a second time. And I hear a lot of clients saying, we want to talk about business process mapping. We need to think about how we use GRC systems to better monitor the risks around that and so on. But when I think about this crisis or any crisis, one thing that we pertinent to all of them is it's an external event. It's an event that we cannot control, and it impacts our customers who are external to us as well. So how would we use AI to be better cognizant of the things that might impact us and that will impact our customers? If we just look at static internal systems and legacy systems, then we're going to have a problem. So, I mean, I'll put that to the rest of the panel. Back to you, Lee, about...
No, that's great, mate. Thank you very much. And, we can build on that as we go through the next 20 odd minutes. But in terms of just getting a quick question to Thomas and then to Chris, really. There's one for Thomas around what emerging technologies do you see helping GRC professionals achieve greater resilience and to address their regulatory obligations?
Right. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. So I think to me the number one emerging technology is AI. We have heard it a lot this evening already. Interestingly, none of my customers that I've served over the past decade have been taking AI as a solution into account. However, what I've also seen is over the past years, I've seen an increase of interest and maybe even readiness for them to start leveraging that. Also, interestingly, like more than a decade ago, I received my master's in AI, and one of my first.
I said it was recent.
Yeah. Well, I got a recent certification as well because when I started to apply for a job, interestingly, the commercial companies didn't really know what to do with me, and that has been a very big change over the last number of years. Within the GRC domain, I think machine learning is the branch of AI most promising and valuable. Just as GRC programs, so we help customers implement big GRC programs leveraging GRC tooling, and just as they are journeys and program evolves, so does in my view the potential to leverage AI. So over time, the amount of valuable GRC data increases, gaps become visible, and things become more integrated and connected. And one thing that machine learning loves is good quality data, and I've heard it a number of times already. I think with Nicola already, and Georgios, of course, mentioning that as well. So one of the interesting things is that with AI, different solutions, it's applicable in many different areas. So we can start small with the low-hanging fruit and increasing complexity over time, so that we can let AI prove itself to the business. So let's say the land and expand methodology incrementally instead of the big bang disruptive approach. And some examples are a lot of new laws and regulations are coming in, and
we might
as an organization.
Sorry, we might have to hold on the examples just in terms of time, Thomas. But
sure.
If that's all right, it's just quite a few questions coming through, and I know that I promised to try and finish at 7:20, but that was a great answer, and we can build on that in a second. I just wanted to get Chris involved into the conversation, and really it was to do with, I know you're from the law tech side and from the operations side, the legal side, how you're seeing accountability, and who is accountable, for this kind of technology that's being implemented, or how are people managing accountability?
Look, it's one of the biggest questions that come up, and lawyers get very nervous around risks, and AI in particular is a huge source of debate, and often it kind of starts with, I always find it fascinating, it always makes me laugh when lawyers will talk about, when they talk about AI, the question is, well, how accurate is it? What's the percentage of accuracy that you're getting through? And I kind of want to throw it right back to them and say, well, what's your percentage rate of accuracy? Because not all of our cases work out the way we want them to. So it's interesting, because the next thing they then will always talk about is who becomes accountable for the decisions that AI is making. And it's picking up on what Georgios was saying before. We're nowhere near the stage where AI is able to deliver full decisions that we can act upon without somebody having to do some kind of triage before it goes through. But it is that question that we will face, and that will become more prevalent later on as AI starts to build, is actually where does the accountability sit? Who is it that becomes responsible ultimately for decisions that AI is making? And going back to the framework that sits behind it as well, I mean, where does the accountability sit against that as well? Because this is all part of what the decision process becomes, and it really becomes a focus, therefore, in terms of who becomes responsible for what, particularly if things start to go wrong.
That's great points, and that's with my background in the Big Four as well. Accountability is always something. Obviously you've got the senior manager certification regime coming out as well. How that's going to be built into kind of the technology that takes away the accountability. But I don't want to drive us down too much of a rabbit hole on that. But in terms of another question that's come in actually, which maybe Chris might not be, but I'll throw it out there and then put your finger up. On disintermediation, do you think FinTech can disintermediate Google, Facebook, etc., etc.? That was Andrew Churchill again. Use some easier words for me to read out, mate, on a small text. But Chris, is that one for you, Chris Skinner?
I can take any question. I know Mr. Churchill quite well, so hello, Andrew. I mean, disintermediation has been a term thrown around for over a quarter of a century, and it hasn't happened. And I think it's more a hope and a dream of people than a reality, which goes back to what I was saying in my opening discussion around banks exist and are regulated for a reason. It's not because they want to be regulated the way they are. It's because it's a resilience and reliability and stability structure that has to be endorsed and enforced by government. And what's interesting for me is, as the debate went around just now, and I'll throw this back out there, and Lee, you can moderate this, but what's interesting for me is GRC, ESG, and AI. So the reason I mention it is that banking is at the core, finance is at the core of all of the issues we face in the future around the environment and sustainability and corporate governance and business. And my belief is that it will become far more of a requirement from government for finance to behave ethically and responsibly in how they finance business in the next decade, and how they enforce businesses that are doing things that are bad for the planet or bad for society to rein back on those operations by not financing those operations over the next decade. And I think technology, and particularly AI, will play a very specific part of enforcing that regulatory structure. And it's a very different way of thinking, because right now, a lot of banking has no real requirement to enforce being socially useful. But in the next decade, I think that's going to be something the government will ask the banks to do. And a good example of why that's happening is right now. In this crisis, the financial system is the link between government and small business and consumer. And so that link and that structure of regulatory requirement, because banking is part of governance, becomes very interesting in the next 10 years post-pandemic, as we move into focusing more on the climate emergency and the sustainability of our planet in general.
No, that's a very good point. I think I did see a hand get raised then, and I've realized that now I'm not on screen with my camera. I can't use my homemade wheel of risk fortune. So I think Gareth Evans had his hand up for add to that point.
And I'll be quick, because I can see that Nicola below me might had a point as well. But I say to the point on AI, I totally agree. The biggest problem I see with ESG in terms of kind of sensible measures to say who do we invest in and who we don't, is that so much of the data we rely on today is self-generated. And so to the extent that AI, or frankly any capability, can help us get with independent, objective advice on who is, doing the right things from an ESG perspective, will be really vital. And I'll stop there and pass to Nicola
Yeah, and just before you do, I think she's just dropped, I think, actually. But in terms of Peter Shelnick actually had a question about would AI ultimately become self-regulating, which you've just touched on there as well, actually. And I think if I just try and send her another request, I think a call came in on a laptop. Would anyone else like to add to that at all?
I'll just say quickly that, building on what Gareth and others have just said, AI will become a method by which regulators get direct access to data and direct access to markets. We've already seen that happening in Austria and other countries where the regulators are starting to look at direct automated regulatory requirements. And so if the regulator gets direct access to financial systems, then they will start to add the things like ESG into the governance of those systems.
Great, thank you, Chris. Nicola, I think you had a point around the element that Gareth was talking about, or the piece.
Actually, yeah, Chris's point on climate I thought was really interesting. I'm sorry, I had a bad connection and dropped off, so I don't know if the flow of the conversation has moved on. So I think it's really interesting with the changes that open banking bring, direct information, direct access to that type of data with the right consent. I think we'll possibly see a pincher movement as the regulators start to think about the role of banks and industry in the climate agenda. But equally, I think consumers will start to hold organizations to account as they start to think about, what better insights that they can get through the use of FinTech and through the use of that data that will then start to kind of give them that power where they could make some really interesting decisions about climate and climate change. So I think we'll see a pincher movement all connected through technology, data, FinTech and regulation.
Fantastic, thank you, Nicola. There's a question that's come in from Terence Lee, actually. And I believe it I'm going to try and turn it into the conversation we had, because for everyone out there, I do have pre-calls to try and align everything. So we spoke about this with Chris, Gareth and Thomas, I think the other day. But the question was really around big challenges in supervisory authority documents. I think Terry goes on to mention impact tolerances, but in terms of the challenges to maintain them, and it just triggered something that Chris, me and you were talking about around e-signing, and okay, supervisory authority documents are going to go through this flow eventually, but obviously on the legal side, that's what you're looking at. But you mentioned about it's 20 years since e-signing started, and that's not really out there fully until the COVID-19. So I wondered if you had any response to that.
Yeah, and look, you're absolutely right, because it's been crazy that these technologies and the ability to do this has been around for a long time, but it took COVID to really start to trigger a change of way of doing things, and having certainly lawyers who feel like the most resistant to change, let alone resistant to the adoption of technology. Having to move away from wet signing, which just seems like an almost impossible task, but it has triggered something in that suddenly we've started to see firms coming together, working with regulators, so of course bringing in the Law Society, as well as the tech providers. And it's a real rare thing to see these groups of people coming together to try and find solutions. And hopefully it will get us closer towards embedding the way that we should be working, which if you can start to unlock that, then you can unlock so many more things. Because again, as you start to implement new processes and new tools, and you find ways of adopting them, it becomes easier to bring the next piece on board. And the more that we do of that, then the more data we start to gather, which means we've got more and more information at our fingertips to be able to drive things forward. So it's an essential, but it's a challenge, and it does need that kind of core group of people to take control. And to be able to do it. I mean, one of the biggest questions that we were still having, and it's only kind of 4 weeks ago we started looking at e-signing and the challenges to adopting it, there were still questions around the legality of signing things, and that became witnesses and who needs to be present when these signings are being done. And it's just crazy to me that we are this far down the line of having the ability to do it, and we're still asking those questions.
No, that's very, very pertinent to the conversation. It's a very interesting topic for me in terms of the adoption of that, because it's really when I started at PwC in 2000, we were just getting laptops for work, and then we were starting to see it then, and it's not really taken off. There's a couple of questions which I'll just quickly go on to. There's one for Thomas and one for George. The Thomas one is, what do you think the early use cases, and this is from Martin, will be for GRC?
Right. So, I think one of the early use cases are companies are constantly struggling with mapping their controls to the different regulations to show their compliance to those regulations. And this is now one of those processes that basically needs to be done manually. It's something that just needs to be done. It's requested from the regulator. And this is one of those specific tasks that AI can really help out to basically predict those mappings for you. It's in addition, those new laws and or changes to regulations, new regulations that are could be very applicable to your company, to your organization, where also these new regulations coming in, look at cases where there's a link to a content provider feeding your GRC tool with changes to laws and regulations, new laws and regulations, where then AI can propose or predict applicability to your organization. So there are different levels of AI that you could leverage to help customers out to manage that.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom. And I just want to correct, maybe when I introduced you before that, you're actually GRC lead at the Bowmen Group. I may have got that wrong, so I just wanted to reiterate that.
Correct, correct.
No worries. That's my error. Too many things on the screen popping up all over the place. So thank you very much. And quick question then for George then around that's come in from Mark Leipold again is AI. Who owns the patent? If AI creates it, who owns that patent? If the AI creates the information.
Oh. Well, that's one of the. Am I there? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry, I thought you lost me again, and no. I would blame Sky again. You see, that's one of the. That's one of the more futuristic. Well, not that futuristic.
Oh, your laptop's not futuristic.
We've
lost you, George.
Oh, it is. It's Sky is not futuristic. My provider is not futuristic. Anyone from Sky, in the audience, take it back to your engineers. So I recently, came across a PhD student who, in law actually, who wanted to do. She was consulting with me about that. Wanted to do her research on the rights, the human rights. I can't find another term of machines in the future.
Yeah.
So do they have rights and do they have privileges? Yes, exactly. So it's a robot future and all that. You see, it's a very interesting question. I don't think that it's one of these puzzling questions. Who owns the IP? It really depends on. I think this is more of a legal question, and it really depends on how the legal framework of the organization is layered, and also how the courts will be, would interpret that. So it's less of a technical question. It's a really, very good questions. Very good question, but I'm sorry I can't answer it.
No. Thank you for trying. No, it was a great question. Really, just conscious of the time. So hopefully we can go on for another 10 minutes, but just trying to throw it out to the panel then, and whether somebody wants to put their hand up. But trying to summarize, is regulation a blocker to technology, or will they work together to eventually help us become more resilient? Just trying to wrap up that question. Has anyone got any thoughts on the? Chris?
Yeah, I'd say it's not a blocker to technology at all. It's the attitude of the institution of the government that's creating the regulation. So when we've looked at the rise of FinTech, the UK became a leader because it was based around outcomes and principles-based regulation that was loose and allowed the innovation to take place with the right anticipated objectives, and that was emulated in Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, and other authorities. You'd have some very prescriptive regulatory structures in some countries, and equally you have some very fragmented and federated regulatory structures, such as those in America, that actually, because it's federated and fragmented, means that innovation and technology finds it very difficult to achieve outcomes. What's interesting is that we look at America, for example, and the fact they have the internet giants of Amazon and Facebook and Twitter and Google, but they exist because they are outliers to the regulatory structures of Washington, and equally they've created very effective lobbying to protect themselves against Washington. So, regulation is not a barrier for innovation and technology, as long as the regulatory body that's creating that regulation understands how to use it and leverage it and deploy it. And I think that's the issue, that in a lot of countries they use it very badly.
No, thank you, Chris. And I know on the call we did earlier this week, we mentioned, banking is actually number 18th, near the bottom. Was it, Chris? In most innovative industries. I can't remember what you said the top was, but I know banking was 18th. Sorry, Chris?
Just below textiles.
That was it, yeah, just below textiles, which I thought was very interesting. So is there anyone else that wants to just to help summarize the questions? Obviously, again, the title.
Yeah.
Oh, Thomas?
Yeah. Am I audible? Yeah. So adding to the point of Chris above for me, I think it's also the point that the bigger tech companies or tech companies in general need to prove themselves to be trustworthy, to show that they can deal and handle those loose regulations rather than strict strict laws and regulations. And take for example IBM that announced to stop use facial recognition because of bias and inequality. It's something that's going on for quite some time, and this is one of those pitfalls of AI that you need to be very aware of. So yeah, I think that is very important message also to those companies.
No, definitely. Thank you, Thomas. And then just really to summarize this, how helpful will said technology be in helping drive operational resilience? So what other technologies or data services might be necessary? That's an open question. I know Gareth, Chris, or Nicola haven't. Do you one of you three want to take that one, or open to anyone really? So how helpful will technology be in helping drive resilience? What other technologies do you think maybe might be necessary? Gareth, I think. Are you frozen?
No. Yeah, no. So, do you know what? Can I just echo something the two Chris were saying earlier, just before we go on to that, which is that the error rate for AI in good applications, in certain applications, is no worse than it is for humans, right? But I think banks understandably are reticent to do anything until the regulator says it's okay to do it. So until regulators say this is a framework by which we accept that it's no worse than human error, then that's what we should do. But because it was a really pertinent point raised earlier. I think in terms of technology now going forward, look, the ones I'm talking about are frankly more tactical. So I'm hearing time and time again, we need to find a better way of connecting those systems that help us understand our underlying assets, and to the extent they are pertinent to those processes or those services that cannot afford to fall down tomorrow, right? So that's a mix of process mapping, KRIs, and increasingly I think we'll hear about key resilience indicators, not just key risk indicators, and our ERP systems, whatever we use to run the bank operations day to day. The open question for me then is the role that AI can play in having a more external view, because the technologies I'm describing are internal looking. And so, as I was saying earlier, how might AI be better at understanding and predicting human behaviour during a crisis? And that, for me, is an open question.
Well, George, as long as Sky works here.
Yeah, exactly. I think these are really, really interesting points, and I think I will go back to my point about explainability, and I think this is where this is area. I think this is very interesting what Gareth just said. That systems are no worse than human beings. So why do we trust, the human being? I think part of the answer is because we can interrogate the human being and find out what was the logic for doing something. Whereas, especially where you get to the more efficient AI, the black box, approaches, the machine learning, the neural networks, the multi-layer convolutional neural networks, that you don't know what's happening behind. You just have a decision that is just churned out. It may well be right, but that's not good enough. So I think, this, when we are able to have, and I think we have some way to go, where we'll have more explainability in what the more efficient of these systems can do, then I think we kind of, crack a certain. And I think that this can well be a turning point in the way that we use and implement and trust AI.
That's great. Thanks, George. It's a bit like speed reading. You've got to fill in the blanks when you're listening to because of Sky. Well, we got the gist of it, mate. It made sense. Absolutely.
I'm really sorry.
No problem at all. Then Chris, Nicola, as in Chris Grant or Nicola, is there anything you guys want to just finally summarise with on your stances on this topic for this evening? Nicola?
So yeah, I was just reflecting. I think the question was about will technology help resilience? I think realistically, technology is here to stay. This is about mindset as much as anything else, and that opportunity to be curious about it and to really think about how it will support and enable resilience is the question that we should ask ourselves. Because it's definitely not going to go away. We're seeing innovation in this space all the time. Reg tech is a huge space within the FinTech space. And interestingly, coming back to that point I made about the ability for it to be horizontal, it just creates agility and the ability to be able to pivot between regulated industries. So it's my thoughts on this, Lee, is that technology enables curiosity, and through that we'll start to think about resilience because we'll think about things in a little bit in different ways.
No, that's a brilliant summary, thank you. And Chris G, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I completely agree with Nicola, and I think the themes that everybody's been pulling out there, but there's a real strength in technology is here to stay. That's the thing we all just have to get our heads around. And many of us are and already thinking about it, and it's as it gets implemented, it's then you start to think about the wider piece of what more you could do with it, and ultimately it's giving us control, it's giving us visibility, and it's giving us transparency that we never saw before, and that's what's really going to help us to be able to make informed decisions around where we go next, what we do, or where we've got opportunities to do more, but also where there's risks to be managed, and that's where the real strength comes. So that the sooner we get on board and start to adopt and help to accelerate the technologies that are coming through, the better position we'll be in.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. And then really, we're pretty much bang on time, a little bit over. Is there anything that Chris S or Gareth want to add just as we close? Nope. Are you frozen again, Gareth?
No, I'm done. Honestly, I appreciate that everyone's probably wanting to get onto their drinks or whatever.
No, I think you're right. So firstly, thank you everybody who's an attendee and who's been listening in and sending in all the great questions. And then secondly, please let me thank the speakers for giving up their time and the panelists as well. We put in some time this week and late last week to align topics and make sure we weren't going to duplicate any responses, etc. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe and have a great evening, and see you all soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.